gotta say it over again.
Oh, do I really have to say it?
There was no audio.
Okay, so I'll do it again. Hi, I'm Tom Christensen. I'm the director of the China and the World program here at Columbia University. This is our last event in our speaker series, and our speaker series has been really packed this semester with lots of great events. And I wanted to take the opportunity to thank the associate director of the program, Daniel Sahensky, who organizes all this stuff, sometimes on short notice. And it's been a particularly successful semester for our activities. So thanks to Daniel. And today we have a special event because it's one of our own fellows. Xiaonan Wang is a current CWP fellow for 2022 to 2023. And he received his PhD from the Department of Government and Politics at the University of Maryland, a program which we have great relations with. His advisor, Margaret Pearson, is one of the greatest experts on China's interaction with the international political economy in the world. And another professor in that department is Scott Kastner, who was a China and the World Fellow back at Princeton when the program was there, and has been a very active alum of the program. So we have a warm spot for the University of Maryland, who actually hosted one of our annual workshops and conferences several years ago during a hurricane, as I recall.
Yeah, gale force winds.
Yeah, gale force winds that took down trees, and the university closed on us, but Daniel saved the day by arranging for us to meet in alternative locations. So starting in the fall of 2022, Xiaonan is going to be doing what we want our fellows to do, which is entering the classroom on a full-time basis. And he's got a job at CUNY Baruch College as an assistant professor of political science. So I want to congratulate him on that. He studies the domestic and international political economy of China. His dissertation is actually on domestic issues, on bureaucratic issues in China, but he has a project that fits the China and the World program's goal, which is about China's foreign economic relations with regions like Africa and China's influence in those regions that derive from those economic activities. And his talk today is entitled Overseas Investment as Soft Power, Chinese and US FDI in Africa. And without further ado, I will turn it over to our fine fellow, Xiaonan Wang.
Okay, so thanks, Tom, for the introduction, and thanks CWP to give me this opportunity. So the project I'm going to present today is Overseas Investment as Soft Power, Chinese and US FDI in Africa. And this is actually like one of the several projects I work with Professor Margaret Pearson and Joe, my colleague at the University of Maryland. So the motivation of this project is that we notice the increasing significance of Chinese investment in Africa. So this figure shows the year-by-year FDI flow from China and also from the United States. And we can see that quite clearly, like China has overtaken like the United States in terms of the FDI flow since around 2012. So in terms of the volume of FDI, in terms of inflow, we can observe economic fact as the rise of China and the decline of the US. And this economic fact is even more important if we put it under the background of the US-China competition. So like in one picture, we can see that it's Xi Jinping made a keynote speech like Zoom, because it's in 2021 on the 8th Forum of China-African Cooperation. And in another like picture, we can see like it's Blinken met with his counterpart in South Africa during his like African tour, like in August 2022. And quite interestingly, like during Blinken's African tour, he actually explicitly mentioned that the US effort to strengthen the relationship with Africa is not about trying to oust anyone else, but he also like acknowledged that there exists like a common narrative that to say that now the African continent are the latest like playing field in the competition between great powers. So no matter like whether the US is like intended to compete head to head with China in Africa, there does exist this type of narratives there. And the Chinese response to Blinken's statement is also quite interesting. Like the Wang Wenbin, he's the speaker, like for the foreign minister. He says that like what matters is how African people see China-African cooperation, and we believe the African people are sharp-eyed. So, like under this background, we really want to know what are the political implications of the investment. So more specifically, we want to know whether the investment projects from China and the United States translates to influence of China and the US. And also whether like this investment projects translates to affinity to China and the US. And also we focus on citizens' perceptions, not only because we believe that African people are sharp-eyed, but theoretically, while we know that the foreign policy is often considered driven by elites, however, especially like in democratic countries, citizens' perceptions could be like quite important in a sense that it can indirectly affect the foreign policy. So we think that the citizens' perceptions towards the investment project from China and US is an important aspect, and that's what we want to study like in this project. And this is actually an extension of our previous works on Chinese investment. So in one project, we study does Chinese FDI inspire support for China's model of development? So this actually focuses on the consequence on the perceptions towards China. And we find that actually no, it actually undermines support. And we are able to identify several negative factors, such as taking jobs and business away, and land grabbing, and the quality of the products, which contributes to like the a decline of support on the China model. And also like in a nuanced sense, there are also some positive factors driven by this investment project, although the overall perceptions towards the China model are negative. So the positive factors include the contributions to development and also the price of the products. And in another project, we study, do African political leaders benefit from Chinese FDI? So in that project, it actually focuses on how Chinese FDI affects African domestic politics. And we find that, like for African political leaders, upfront project announcements, yes, they benefit from this. But however, after the project implementation, they actually get more negative views, and we interpret like the results as unmet expectations, as the citizens have very high expectations when the project's announced, and then they get frustrated, and then they blame the political leaders. So, and the project I'm presenting today is an extension of the first project. Does Chinese FDI inspire support for the China model of development? And this project like differs from like our previous ones in that we compare investment from China and the United States to respond to two questions. So one question is that like no matter what effects we find from the Chinese FDI, no matter it's positive or negative, this is a question that is this a function of Chinese FDI, or is this a function of FDI more generally? And a second question is that like investment projects from different countries often occur in the same place. So when we just evaluate the investment project from China, like those projects may occur in the same place where US investment occurs. So this creates this type of problems. So we build on our previous projects and we make some like improvement on this. So how do Chinese and US FDI in Africa affect citizen assigned influence and affinity to these two countries? So let's discuss like several concepts and the mechanisms that can help us understand the process. So the first step we think about the process is that we conceptualize influence and affinity as two independent dimensions. So a lot of studies, they either evaluate or focus on influence, or they focus on affinity. But we think that, like, first we think it's two independent dimensions. But also we think that we should consider them together to get a full picture. So what I mean is that I can see that okay, I feel that the United States has huge influence, but at the same time, I don't like US. So it could like occur like at the same time. And also alternatively, I can say that, well, I like China a lot, but unfortunately, I think China's influence in our country is quite small. So in that sense, we think influence and affinity, they are two independent dimensions. And as a consequence, then we have 4 different scenarios. And if China and the US, if there's a like implicit or explicit competition on soft power, then the ideal place here is that they have huge influence, and at the same time the influence or the affinity is positive, and we call that in that place they have high soft power. So that's the ideal place, like great powers want to be. And well, if it locates in the other like places, then the implication becomes more complicated, right? It could be China has huge influence in African, but African people does not like China. So or in all other scenarios. So that's the first step we think about, like influence and affinity. And then how should FDI or how should the investment projects affect citizens' perceptions, or what we call citizen assigned influence and affinity? So what are the mechanisms that could lead to the linkage between the investment projects on the one hand and their perceptions on influence and affinity on the other hand? So the most important mechanism we identify is the visibility of foreign firms and projects in their local communities. So this is actually a very intuitive way, like we think about this. So if in your community there's a Chinese investment or US investment projects, you may feel something like, or you may, or those projects may be visible to some sense. So by visibility, it could mean a lot of things. So it could be if there is a manufacturing factory very close to your community, then you could be employed by those factory, or you have people you know employed, and then you feel a presence of China or US. Or it could be just see the banners every day with things related to China. Or it could be, for example, like what we find is that there are a lot of cell phone stores from China in the United States. You may have actual experience in those stores. You may have a Chinese cell phone and you need maintenance in those stores. So all those type of experience is what we call visibility. And it could also be like a media reports, like once there are Chinese investment project, like the high profile, like a ceremony to celebrate like the start of a factory or things like that. So we think visibility is a very important mechanism that might affect citizens' perceptions on influence and affinity. And in terms of how this visibility might affect their influence, like the first very straightforward like mechanism is that if you experience like or if a Chinese investment project are visible to you from, although it's a Chinese firms or non-state actors, but you might associate like those investment projects with the country of origin, with China. So that's one a straightforward mechanism we think. So the visibility may lead to increased influence from the FDI sending country. However, there's another mechanism that might not be that obvious. So basically, it means that if you are exposed to a Chinese investment, and if I ask you, how do you think about US influence? So there could be like different scenarios. So one scenario could be, if I am exposed to a Chinese investment, yes, I feel China's influence is increasing. But does it convey any information about US influence? So one scenario is that it could be, no, it does not contain anything about US, right? But if like the global narratives, if the narrative of US-China competition is somehow entrenched, like in the citizens' prior views, so this type of exposures to country A's investment might prompt association of the influence with country A's competitor. So it could be that if I am constantly exposed to a Chinese investment project, I might feel that the US influence is declining in my country. And actually, a very similar phenomenon is happening in the United States. So some scholars find that with the globalization, especially with the opening of China, a lot of US manufacturing factories has to be shut down because they cannot compete with the cheap product imported from China. And for like a US residents living in those communities where they experience the shutdown of US factory, it actually prompts them to connect the shutdown of factory to a lot of like global narratives or higher level narratives about politics. So for example, they feel that the US as a country is going in a wrong direction. Or they feel that, especially for white Americans, they feel that their status in the country is declining. Although it's just the factory shutting down, and the reason is because the competition with the products from China. So we do have some like support on this hypothesis in terms of the everyday experience might prompt association with global narratives. So if that's true, we should find that the Chinese investment project might make the citizens feel decreased influence from the United States. And the same thing for the US. So the US project should prompt a decreased feeling of China's influence if our like if this mechanism like exists. So this is about influence. And the second aspect is about affinity. And in terms of affinity, we really think it's an empirical question in terms of there are both mechanisms that enhance a positive affinity and mechanisms that undermines affinity towards the FDI sending countries. So for those positive like mechanisms, so we can think about the most direct way is that FDI creates jobs and potentially like well-paid jobs, good jobs to the local community. And also there are other like positive externalities like the increased tax revenues, the technology and skills. So there are a lot of good things comes with the FDI. But also there are also mechanisms that could undermine affinity. For example, it can crowd out local firms. So it depends on who you are, like whether you are the labor or you are the capital. It could crowd out local firms, or it has other negative externalities in terms of it increases the labor market volatility because it's integrated with the global market, or it could have some environmental costs or corruption, especially if the firms have some like bad practice. And also like maybe particular to the African continent is that no matter it's a US firm or Chinese firm, it might create an impression of a colonial-like relationship. So the local citizens may dislike the investments. So and we think that this is really an empirical questions. Like we have to rely on the data to tell us like which mechanisms dominate the effects. But we should also expect that the previous effects, that the previous similar effects on influence in terms of association of country A's investment with the affinity of country A's competitor should apply as well in terms of if you like China, then you should dislike US. And in a way that we can test that because potentially we can know if this is really the global narratives, the US-China competition that is working, then the Chinese FDI should only promote prompts like the association to the United States, not to other countries, like not to UK, France. So if that's true, then we are more confident that this is really driven by the global narratives. So the data we use like to empirically evaluate the effects is that we rely primarily on two datasets. So one is a dataset called FDI markets. So this is a project level data on FDI collected by Financial Times. So they tracked the investment projects from every country to every other countries. And in this study, we just use the Chinese and US FDI in African countries from 2010 to 2019. And this is a nice data set in terms of its project level. So it's not the aggregated level. So it's document each project. So we know what type of project that is. We know the years. We know like where it's located in terms of the city, and sometimes it's not in the city, it's in the province. So we have a lot of like project specific information. And based on this data set, or build on this data set, like we further complete two additional information. So the location of the project. So for some projects, it's down to the city level, and for some it's province or the country level, and that's not precisely enough for us. So for each project, we go ahead to try to find a more precise location. For example, if it's a factory, then we try to find where that factory is on Google Maps. And then we can document the coordinates, the latitudes and longitudes. Or if it's a Huawei store, then we try to find where that store is. So we want to find a more precise geolocation on that.
And you know where the respondents were when they responded?
Oh yes, like I will show like the survey data. So like the survey data is also geocoded. That's why we want to we can do this. So and another piece of information we want to gather is that so in the original data set of FDI markets, they already document the years, like the project enters the data set. But the years could be the year that project is announced, or the year that project starts operation. So we further distinguish these two types of information, which could be crucial, like to our empirical strategy later. And also, if we cannot find the information from the original data set, we go ahead to search online to try to identify like when the project is operational. For example, like when the project enters the FDI markets dataset, it could be at that year it's announced. For example, it's announced in 2022. But now we want to know whether it's operational or not, and in which year. So the precise geolocation and the year that the project starts operation are the two pieces of information we add to the original dataset. And the second dataset we rely on is the Afrobarometer survey data. So the survey data is geocoded, so which is like for our like benefits. So that's why we can connect these two datasets together. So we are able to know where the respondents are and where the projects are. And also another nice thing is that we also know like when the survey is conducted, when the interview is done. So we rely on round 6 survey. The only reason we rely on round 6 survey is because the relevant questions is only asked in round 6. And the round 6 survey is done in 2014 and 2015. So this is some like information about the dataset. So the total number of Chinese FDI projects is 419, documented by the Financial Times. And among these projects, we are able to identify 208 projects. So they are precise geolocations. So, well, obviously this is not ideal, as we discard like half of the data, but this really increase the impression, like the increase the precision like of the data set. And also similarly, like for the US FDI, the total number of projects is close to like 1,000, and we are able to find like 500, more than 500 projects. So basically, we discard half the projects, but we focus on the projects where we have a precise geolocations. And we compare the precisely and imprecisely geocoded projects, which is the project we kept and the project we discard. And they are not systematically different in terms of the sector, size, country, and year in the dataset. So it's not that it's not the case that certain type of projects enters our dataset. So they are more or less like the same. But again, it's not ideal. But the problem is that if we include all projects, we do not know like their geolocations. So it also creates problems. So in this sense, we rely on the precisely geocoded projects. And then the number of survey respondents, like we focus on the respondents in the countries with Chinese and US FDI. So this is a visualization of the projects and the survey areas, like on the map. So I think this might give you a more intuitive sense of what we are doing here. So the triangles are Chinese FDI projects, and the circles are the US FDI projects, and the gray area are the areas where the afrobarometer round 6 are surveyed. So here, then we can see that from this like map, we can see that we are able to identify whether the respondents are close to Chinese projects and whether respondents are close to US projects. And well, we use different like distance cutoffs. I mean, how to define closeness. I mean, well, how to categorize this project as close and another project, another respondents as not close. So we use different cutoffs, like 25 kilometers, 15 kilometers, all the way up. So this is actually what we are doing in terms of the combining like the two data sets. Then we know the proximity to investment projects for each respondent. And also we need to measure the influence, and we need to measure the affinity. So the nice thing about the round 6 afrobarometer data is that they ask very direct questions on this. So one question we rely on in terms of the influence is they ask which of the following countries do you think are the most influential countries? And the respondents are forced to choose one among the following. So you either choose US or China or other countries. So the nice thing is that they not only ask US and China, they also ask like the other countries, like the former colonial countries. So to test whether the results are driven by the global narratives, actually the former colonial countries can be served as a type of placebo tests, because if it's driven by global narratives, we should not observe any like effects on the former colonial countries, and everything should happen between China and US. And the most influential country question force the citizens to choose one among the following. And so it's actually a measurement of relative influence. And there's another question that asks, how do you think about China's economic influence, whether it's none, a little, some, or a lot? And conceptually, this is a measure of the absolute influence, which we think is different, and we will show that in the empirical tests. unfortunately, like we have no counterpart question. How do you think about U.S. economic influence? And so that's the measurements on influence. And for affinity, we rely on the question of best model of development. So again, the citizens are forced to choose one among the following countries. So how do we estimate the effects? So the empirical strategy is that we link the proximity to investment projects to the citizens' perception. So intuitively, we can identify respondents living close to Chinese or US FDI projects. Then we have respondents not living close to Chinese and US FDI projects. Then we can compare their perceptions using different distance cutoffs. However, this strategy has a couple of problems. The first problem is that the location of investment project is not random, right? We can imagine that the investment projects from US or from China, they may be primarily located in urban areas, in areas where people are highly educated. And so, which means that for respondents living close to Chinese FDI and respondents not living close to Chinese FDI or US FDI, they are not really comparable because they are two very different groups. And then any difference we find from these two groups could be attributed to other factors other than the exposure to Chinese or US FDI. So this is really a problem for us in terms of location of investment projects in not random. So the question is how to compare. And the second empirical challenge is that the Chinese investment and US investment, they can collocate with each other. And if they collocate with each other, so in our data set, so more than 75% of Chinese and US FDI projects collocated with each other. And so, okay, so we examine that the collocation is not likely driven by political factors. It's not that we say US investment there, so China wants to match a project there. So it's not driven by that. It's primarily driven by economic factors. As we observe that more than 87% of the collocated projects are in the same sector. So it's really economic factors that similar projects tend to locate in the same place. However, this really creates a challenge for us in that if there is a collocation, how to identify the separate effect of Chinese and US FDI? What you observe, if both Chinese FDI, US FDI, no matter what you find, it's really hard to interpret. However, it also create an opportunity for us to examine the US-China competition, right? In places where you have both China and US FDI, what's the net outcome? Whether China is the winner or the US is the winner, or they cancel out on each other. So it also creates an opportunity, but also a challenge. So to deal with the first problem, so the non-random FDI locations, so we are able to rely on other scholars who have done similar works using this type of strategy in a way that we can leverage the timing of the survey and the timing of the project. So we can imagine in one scenario, the respondents are surveyed in 2014, and the respondent is living close to a project that has been operational since 2012. So in this case, we code the respondent as active, which means close to active projects. And we can imagine another scenario. A respondent is surveyed in the same year, in 2014, but he's living close to a place where a project will be operational in 2016, which means that in 2014, there's no project in his or her community, but it will be in 2 years. So if that's the case, we code that respondent as eventual. And if we compare these two types of respondent, we can more confidently assume that these two types of places are more or less similar, because the only difference is that one place already have FDI, another place is going to have FDI soon. So maybe they are both in the urban area, both in places where citizens are highly educated, or other unobserved factors. They are both similar. And more importantly, if we restrict the comparisons within a similar geographic area, like in our study, like it's close to the state or the province level, like within that country, then we assume that in the same year, respondents living close to active projects and respondents living close to and respondents in places where there will soon be a project are more or less similar and comparable. And this figures shows that yes, like this strategy more or less works. So sorry, it's a bit small, but the idea is that we can compare the individual characteristics of the respondents living close to active projects, respondents living in places where there are going to be projects soon, and also respondents not living close to any project. So let's focus on like whether they are living in the urban area or not. So it's quite clear. For respondents not living close to any projects, they are primarily rural. And for respondents close to projects, they are more likely to be urban. And if we restrict the comparisons between active and eventual type of respondents, we can see that the gap is quite narrowed. So it means that by comparing active type respondents and eventual type respondents, we are really comparing respondents that are more or less similar in terms of their individual characteristics. And it's a similar like pattern for respondents close to US FDI. So that's the first way we deal with the challenges. And the second way, and the second problem, the collocation. So in that sense, so we categorize the respondents as close to active Chinese projects only, which means that we exclude the collocation patterns. So we are able to identify a subgroup of respondents close to Chinese FDI only, and similarly to identify a subgroup of respondents close to US FDI only. So in that sense, we are able to estimate a separate effects of Chinese and US FDI. However, like there's a caveat here, and we can see that like only 31% of respondents living close to active Chinese FDI are living close to active Chinese FDI only, which means that a majority of the respondents living close to Chinese FDI, they also collocate with US projects. So this, I mean, for US FDI, it's fine because we still have a large amount of observations. They are only exposed to US FDI. But for respondents close to Chinese FDI, this really creates a challenge, as you can see in the empirical results. So and also we think that the collocation patterns may have different consequence on the relative and absolute measure of influence, because collocation should primarily affect relative influence, but not necessarily absolute like influence. I mean, even though you are, for example, if I live close to both Chinese and US FDI, if the question is just how do you think about China's economic influence, in that sense, I might still say that a lot. But if you ask me about do you think China and US, which country are the most influential country, then in that case, the results might be ambiguous. So like the collocation patterns may have different implications on relative and absolute measures. And we also exploit this nuance difference in the empirical results. So like, let me present several main results here. So first is the citizen assigned influence, how FDI affects the citizen assigned influence. So let's focus on the right panel first. So let's first ignore the closeness to Chinese FDI. So let's first focus on close to US FDI. So I think there's a quite clear pattern. If you are living close to US FDI, you are more likely to think that US is the most influential country and China is not the most influential country. So you are more likely to choose US and less likely to choose China as the most influential country. And the results are very similar for close to US FDI and close to US FDI only, because we have more than 60% of respondents, they are only exposed to US FDI only. And more importantly, the results of former colonial countries, it's zero. Like, so it's really US-China competition. It's really this type of global narratives. Because alternatively, like we can think about, okay, close to US FDI, increase US influence, but the decreasing is evenly distributed, like in other countries, but that's not the case. The decrease is concentrated on China. And then let's focus on close to Chinese FDI. Then we find that this is really an ambiguous pattern and not actually fit like our prior expectation of what it should be, because we expect it should be close to Chinese FDI, increase the selection of China as the most influential country and decrease US, but that's not the case. And our explanation is that because of collocation patterns, because most of the respondents living close to Chinese FDI, they also exposed to US influence. So it kind of like cancel out like the results. So this is effects by distance. So again, like the close to US FDI, there's a very clear pattern. The effects attenuate across like a distance, but for Chinese FDI, like the pattern is quite ambiguous and not exactly fit our prior expectation. So because the effects on Chinese FDI, the question on most influential countries really does not fit our expectation. So we further like examine like Chinese influence using the question of how do you think about China's economic influence, which we conceptualize it as a measurement of the absolute influence. And here we are able to observe a quite clear pattern. So living close to Chinese FDI, no matter whether they are collocation with US FDI or not, increase the absolute measurement of China's economic influence. And interestingly, the close to US FDI only undermines people's perceptions on China's economic influence. So this is really like a kind of like a mechanism that US FDI undermines people's perceptions of China's influence. Well, the close to US FDI is not significant because there's collocation patterns with Chinese FDI, but the close to US FDI only is more like prominent, like in terms of the effects. So this is the effects of the influence, and here we can go to affinity. So in terms of affinity, like the findings are quite striking to us. In terms of close to Chinese FDI, citizens are less likely to choose China as the best mode of development and more likely to choose US. And actually, it's a similar thing for US. People living close to US FDI are more likely to choose China as the best model and less likely to choose US as the best model. And again, like the former colonial countries, the effects are non-results. So it's really a US-China thing. And it's striking to us that previously we find that, okay, the Chinese FDI undermines the support for the China's model of development. Maybe the US FDI is different in this sense. However, like the results are quite different from what we might expect, because the US FDI follow the same path of China. Although, like more nuanced way is that like the substantive size of the declining of US model is smaller than the declining of the Chinese model. And here again, like it's a effect by distance. So we can see, so in these figures, we can see a very clear pattern of the effects, how the effects attenuate by distance. So it's really driven by the proximity, like to like the projects. So a summary of the results, like go back to our like conceptualization of influence and affinity as two independent dimensions. And interestingly, we find that living close to Chinese or US FDI actually locate in that place. So neither China nor US locate in the places where we call that high soft power. They're both locating in that place. And well, normatively, what it means, maybe you can say that's the worst case. Like you have a huge influence, and then people like don't like you. So maybe that's the worst place you want to be. But that's the effect we find like from US and Chinese investments. And like the contributions of these findings is that existing studies have extensively discussed on the supply side of FDI, like the role of the state, for example. And I think it has clarified a lot of like misunderstandings of how it works. Like, so a lot of the projects, even on the Belt and Road, is actually not coordinated or not coordinated well. So actually, a lot of projects are driven by private sectors or firms or local governments. So like another strand of the studies on the supply side focus on the motivation and practice of firms. And the studies compare the practice of Chinese firms and Western firms. And I think this studies also kind of clarify a lot of misunderstandings. I think the recent studies find that in terms of the objective like consequences or the practice, Chinese and West firms are not that different in terms of the labor standards or environmental protection. And also when China and US firms have different practice, the implication is not obvious. For example, Chinese firms may pay lower wage, but they are less likely to hire to fire people, especially like during crisis, like in the 2008 financial crisis. Like a lot of Western firms, like they fire the local employees, but the Chinese firms, like they are not doing this because they are state-owned, they are state-backed. So there are a lot of studies like from the supply side, and we contribute to this literature in terms of we study the receiving side. So when we know how the supply side works, we want to know what's the consequence on the receiving side, and we focus on local citizens' perceptions, as we believe like the African people are sharp-eyed like on this. So and also there are some existing studies on local citizens' perceptions of FDI, and we differ from those studies in that we rely on geocoded project and geocoded survey data, where a lot of other studies rely on the aggregated data. So they are not able to like explore a more nuanced like variations within the same country. And also we compare local citizen perceptions from China and US. So we do not study China alone, do not study US alone, but we put them in the same context. And we also conceptualize influence and affinity as two independent dimensions and evaluate them empirically. So and we noticed that there are increasing studies using very similar approaches to ours, and they focus on local citizens' perceptions of foreign aid. And well, actually, it's like we follow their approach, but we focus on FDI because we think FDI is really different from foreign aid by nature. And a very interesting finding we think from this study is that even if like investment is not coordinated by the state, because aid is very state focused, and it has very clear, most of the time it had very clear political intentions, but FDI may not be the case. So, but even if not coordinated by the state, for example, US FDI, they still have political implications. For example, US FDI undermines people's perceptions of China's influence. But US FDI does not make people think US is the best model of development. So even though the FDI are maybe market-driven, profit-driven, they have important political implications. So what are the implications on US-China competition? Like, the implicit assumption of this competition is that the United States are worried about what China is doing in Africa. Maybe potentially in terms of the rising of China's economic activities. However, we find that when US government is worried about that, the actual consequence of Chinese investments in Africa is actually quite complicated. Because it does not increase the support for the China model. And also the same thing for the US, like the US firms do not increase the support for the US model. So there are some implications like on the US-China competition, like for the policies, like we might want to like dig deeper into the assumptions behind. And I think that's what like this studies offers in terms of the empirical results. So thanks a lot.
Can you bring the mic back?
Yeah, sure.
So I'm going to ask the first question, and I just didn't catch it. I think I wasn't clear what the affinity values were for people who lived close to both US and China.
Oh, so you mean the collocation?
Yeah. If it's co-location, do they tend to dislike both?
Yeah. So yeah. So yeah, that's
But it's not even relative. Like,
yeah. So I think like in this study, I did not show the collocation like results for both influence and affinity. So this is really an ongoing project, and we are going to do that. So I can tell you for the influence part.
Yeah.
For the collocation, they cancel each other out.
Yeah.
So it's a non-result. So we compare respondents who living close to both Chinese and US projects, and respondents close to both eventual Chinese and US project, and we find that it cancels each other out. But I do want to caveat about this in that the number of observations is quite small.
Yeah. Okay.
In that sense. But the result is that they did cancel each other out in terms of influence. And in terms of affinity, like I think I mentioned like briefly in that. So we find that close to Chinese FDI undermines support for China model. Close to US FDI undermines support for US model, increase support for China model. But the effects of close to US FDI is smaller.
On the China.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
So the Chinese investment is doing more damage.
doing more damage to China than US investment is doing to the US.
Yeah, exactly.
I see. Yeah. That makes some degree of sense to
Yeah.
me. So you had the quote from Secretary Blinken, and he was trying to counter the narrative, right?
Right.
It seems to me your argument is really a combination of long-running post-colonial nationalism in Africa that is suspicious of foreign influence in the country, especially when it's really close to your home, right? In combination with African citizens accepting a global narrative that there is a competition between China and the United States in all areas of the world, including in Africa.
Yeah.
So if you're mad at China, you feel better about the United States. If you're mad at the United States, you feel better than you otherwise would about China, even though those things should not necessarily logically be linked in people's minds without the narrative.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the base. So I was impressed by actually Secretary Blinken's quotation, if you call it up, because when I was in the government, we didn't talk that much about strategic competition, even though there was one. Right, there was always a bit of a strategic competition between the United States and China. It wasn't something that we constantly talked about every time we made a public discussion of U.S.-China relations. But on Africa, we were very explicit, and I testified to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee about how we did not view Chinese investments in Africa with envy and worry, except to the degree that it wasn't coordinated with other lenders and therefore was not doing the maximum amount of good, but that we basically saw that as a positive thing, but it wasn't as positive as it could be if it had been coordinated with the World Bank or the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development or any other global construction bank. And we meant it, like we really did mean it, but there was a narrative out there that we should have been really worried, right? So it was, the narrative was still there, but we were trying to counter it. So Blinken's statement, as you have it, mentions that narrative, but he tries also to counter it, which is was refreshing and surprising, because I thought that the Biden administration had adopted a lot of the Trump administration's language about how, all Chinese lending is predatory and should be treated with great suspicion. But he didn't seem to be saying that there.
So that's actually very interesting, because like, I think, as you said, like, US actually mean it when it says that, like, they are not trying to.
I meant it.
Like, and I think like probably Blinken also meant that, but like, like I think what
it's online. You can look it up. It's proof, right? And this is not Monday morning quarterbacking, right?
So the interesting thing is that what we find is that the African citizens, they're kind of like programmed with this type of narrative. So even though like maybe the US government and Chinese government from the supply side, maybe they are not intend to do this type of head-to-head competition, but the presence of US and Chinese investments in their local communities make them think about this narrative. So which is not intended like by the government.
But there's a whole, I'll just finish with this because I want other people to ask questions. So there's a whole realm of economic activity that isn't captured, right? So when we were talking about US economic activity and other major lenders, right? We were talking about development banks and often aid in Africa and comparing that to Chinese business loans for the most part. China doesn't give a lot of aid in Africa or anywhere else. It just doesn't give a lot of aid. It gives infrastructure development loans and for business projects that are supposed to be profitable, right? So we were talking about that sort of comparison. And I wonder if you use that comparison rather than for-profit investments from the United States, whether it might be different, because the one place in the world where George W. Bush was very popular was sub-Saharan Africa. And there were two reasons. One was the anti-AIDS, the PEPFAR's program to fight AIDS. And the second was the Millennium Challenge compacts, which were fairly generous packages for assistance, but the country in question had to prove how they were going to use it in a less corrupt and more transparent way than were required in the past. And regular African citizens apparently appreciated both of those initiatives from the Bush administration. But that was really different than ExxonMobil, building an energy exploitation unit in some African country. Those were separate. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I wonder how that would play out. And is the US still relatively popular for those other programs in those areas, or is that wearing off now that we have multiple follow-on administrations? I just don't know.
Yeah. Thanks for the question. So I think as I mentioned in the presentation, so our project FDI actually follows the studies of foreign aid. So there are some scholars, they are focusing on comparing foreign aid from China and the US using very similar approaches and very similar data in Afrobarometer data. So what they find is that they did not find the Chinese foreign aid increased support for China, but they does find US foreign aid increased support for the United States.
And is the Chinese aid being defined properly? Is it really aid, or is it development loans?
So
are not the same thing.
because the aid also have multiple different sectors, what you say, the anti-AIDS or build a stadium, right? Or it's quite different. So I think what they did is the average effect of all those type of projects. So what they find is that the USA increased support for US, but they did not find the similar effects on aid from China. They also find that the USA increased support for the liberal democracy values in African. And
Chinese
Chinese aid does not undermine the support for the liberal democracy values. So
and USAID helps
increase the support there. But I think, as you said, I think one very different aspects is the composition of the aid from China and United States is quite different, especially nowadays. So,
and what is the Chinese model? When people answer, do they mean they want a single party authoritarian state, or do they mean I want infrastructure emphasis in early stages of development?
Right.
Because the latter is not the same.
That's really important question. So, in terms of the survey question, how the question is asked. So it asks about what do you think is the best model of development for your country? So, well, it's really hard to know, like when citizens answer this questions, what's in their mind, but that's how the question is asked, is about the mode of development. Because I can understand like your question in terms of the China model, the political part of the model and economic part of the model could be quite different.
Right. The economic part,
and
more easily defensible.
People's reactions to that could be quite different. So like it's a limit to us in this starting that we cannot quite distinguish that. We hope we can. But
okay, this isn't an interview with Tom Christensen, so I'm going to open it up to other people. I just was very fascinated. It's a great project, and congratulations, and other people can ask questions. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, you have to use the mic because there are people online, so they have to be able to hear you.
So thanks for this. It is very interesting and very actually inspiring for me. So I have a question. When thinking that the FDI actually changes people's perception, how did you rule out like other things that actually influence like people's perception? And another thing is like, who are the people that you survey? Because there may be like some demographic change. So like maybe young people, or what I'm saying is, maybe young people are more easily to be influenced by negative things. Because the older people, mature people, they have like their own wisdom. So like, so yes. So what is like the people that you survey? What do they look like the demographic picture?
Thanks for the questions. Both are great questions. So in terms of how to rule out other things, so obviously there are a lot of things happening like in the world. And one way we think we try to like separate the effects of FDI is by using like the proximity. So basically we compare like people living close to projects with people living in places where there are going to be projects. So and the assumption here is that in these two places, we think that the other things are more or less like similar. Like in terms of the, for example, if you think about, okay, maybe because they have different prior impression on China or US. Maybe some people just don't like China, some people just don't like US. And the assumption here is that for the group we compare, for people living close to Chinese FDI and for people living in places where there's going to be Chinese FDI in a similar places, we assume like this type of things are similar, and also other things are similar. So this is the way we try to identify like the effects of from FDI. So as you said, how to rule out like the effects are driven by other things, right? So and this the proximity, and also by comparing like active type respondents and eventual type province, like we try to rule out this type of things. But again, this is not perfect, right? You can have like a lot of not a lot of, like, I don't want to undermine myself. So you can have like some challenges even to this
But it's
type.
pretty convincing if the big demographic differences are there are big demographic differences based on their distance from the plant. So
And ideally, I think I didn't mention that in the presentation. So this type of active and eventual, and we leverage the timing. A crucial thing is that the best scenario is that you are active to adjust implemented project and compare it to the respondents close to a soon to be implemented. So the time frame is very narrow. So in this very narrow time frame, and in a similar geographic area, like in the same province, so we assume it's comparable. So that's how we like rule out other things. And the second question about the demographic composition. So the survey like is randomly drawn from different like age groups. But what you implicated is very important because we can further explore the heterogeneous effects among young people and old people. So whether this type of effect we find is mainly driven by young people or mainly driven by old people. Because, for example, especially because I think this is very interesting because US investments has been in Africa for much longer time than in China. So maybe the old people they already experienced the US experience.
Right.
So they may have some prior beliefs that could be different from the young people who never experienced like any of the project.
Right.
So like what you mentioned is actually a very interesting point where we can explore to say the different effects among the young cohort and the old cohort. Thanks.
It's one of the difficult things about these research projects. So you showed the different investment year on year between China and the United States, and you see China gets higher than the United States about 2012, right?
Okay.
But that's not the pool of investment. The pool of investment from the United States is huge.
Right, like
compared
the
to
stock.
China. So there's a lot more US investment in Africa because it's been building there for
Right.
years and years and years and years. It's just the year on year rate that China has surpassed. So Africans have a lot more experience in many places with US investments. Right. Yeah, Marty, go ahead.
Yeah.
Here, you take the mic. You don't need to stand it up. Maybe you do. How many professors does it take? Here we go.
All right. Let me add to what Tom was asking. He mentioned again that, you know, there's a much longer term of U.S. investment than China. What I'm curious is, I don't know if you did any research on this aspect of it, but how African elites play this off. Is there any feeling about how African elites are playing this off again to manipulate both US and Chinese aid in terms of or of FDI?
I'll just hold this.
Yeah, sure. Like a rock star.
Yeah. Good question. So, we did in one project explore the Chinese investment and how it affects the African domestic politics. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to explore similar studies on US investment. But what we found is that so I think statistically or the literature tells us that political leaders typically welcome investment. It's especially in Africa where the capital is quite scarce. So we think that political leaders they welcome and in fact they also compete to attract investment projects. And so however, like in our studies, we find that there's actually a political risk here, because from the politician's perspective, if I successfully attract a project, I want to house the project, I want to validate the project, saying that this is a really good project that will bring 5,000 jobs to the communities and everything will be good. And I show myself in high-profile ceremony to celebrate this stuff. And this, well, this is good for politicians in the short term, but it also creates unrealistic expectations on citizens. So citizens will feel that, oh, you say that, okay, this is going to bring 5,000 jobs. So maybe 2 years later, I will be employed or I will get a higher salary. But the philosophy is that like, if you are like the more like you have, the more likely you are going to be like disappointed. Exactly. So like what we found is that yes, in the short term, this type of announcement really gives the politicians a return. So they get the political dividends from this. But once the projects are implemented, like the citizens have negative views like on the politicians.
So if it's a democracy, you'd expect the opposition to be using that as a target. I think in Gambia they
Yes, yeah, and I think
Angola as well.
right. So in like democratic countries, so the incumbent politicians will pass the project, and the opposition politicians will say, no, I'm sure that yes, there is a lot of like risks of this project. So,
What Mike would say.
so I think you are exactly right about this. But unfortunately, we need to do studies on the US investment and see how it's different from the Chinese investment. Thanks.
Anyone else?
The question online.
Well, you want online, you can read it, and then we'll get a changer.
So this question is from Ian Johnson up at Harvard. He wants to know more, he wants to know more about your concept of soft power that you used earlier in your presentation. He says, strictly speaking, in Nye's original conception, country A's soft power comes from the attractiveness of country A's domestic policies, such as success of its economic, political, or cultural models. Soft power in its purest sense doesn't come from country A's proactive economic, political, or propaganda actions towards country B that may change opinions in country B. So if country A's investment improves the living conditions of locals in country B, and this then changes their view of country A in more positive directions, is this really an example of soft power? Or is this basically influence arising from the provision of economic or material benefits? Or another example, isn't this a function of the attractiveness of country A's model?
Thanks for the question. Actually, this is the point where we struggle a bit. So like, we realize that like in the original definition of soft power, it does not include economic activities. So this is more likely, this is more likely a material benefits. So we're struggling with that. But we also note that in the literature, some of them choose the foreign aid or the FDI as a source of soft power. So, like in this project, we are looking at that in a more way, and go back to why we use the soft power here. So actually, like the core part of our conceptualization is that we want to conceptualize influence and affinity as two independent dimensions. But then what it means. So well, we know what is influence and we know what is affinity. And if we combine them together, what it means. So the way we call it soft power, like in this sense, and we acknowledge that the definition kind of slippery. And I think in the current draft we and we see that we use a better definition of soft power, which acknowledges the economic activities as a source of soft power. But yes, you're right, like in the definition is not.
Okay, Chung, yours up.
Thanks, John, for the presentation. I really like it. So I have two questions. The first one is, so in your study, you treat affinity and influence as if they are two independent dimensions. So I'm wondering, to what extent do they affect each other, or do they affect each other at all? So that's the first one. And second question, I'm interested in the eventual respondents you mentioned in your presentation. So how informed are they regarding future projects? Because the survey data only cover the period between 2014 and 2015, but the FDI data cover the period between 2010 and 2019. So the percentage of those respondents. Thanks.
Thanks, Zhongzhi. So yes, we conceptualize affinity and influences to independent dimensions, and so you ask whether like one independent dimensions that they could like one thing could affect each other. I don't have a clear theoretical response to that, but I'm thinking about if we treat it as empirical questions, how can we like empirically evaluate this? So I think what you mean is that if I for example, if I like China, I'm actually to think China has huge influence, even though China's influence is not that huge. So if that's the case, I think that's interesting scenario.
I think that's true.
So
I can really like Bermuda, but it doesn't mean I think Bermuda has a lot of influence.
yeah, so I think what means is like there's a possibility that these two dimensions could like interact with each other. So I think in this project, the conceptualizing as independent and so we think it's impossible to think about because of different. Because I could like Bermuda, but if Bermuda has very small influence in, for example, in United States, then it has some like foreign policy implications on Bermuda, right? So that's why we conceptualize it as independent.
I think you could justify it this way, that I bet you if you did surveys of Americans, I bet you if it was on a scale and people talked about Chinese power in the United States, I bet you there's a negative correlation between people who believe China is very powerful and people who have a positive feeling about China.
Right. So it could be, I think,
Those who are really worried about China think China is all
right.
And those who tend to have more positive views about China, it's like, don't exaggerate their power, right?
Yeah.
I just think that I've seen that a lot. It's only anecdotal. It's not scientific.
But I think that, that's really good point. That's why we can test about it, like whether it's a fundamental difference between people's perceptions on China, whether it's good or not, and their perceived influence. So maybe misperceptions, like if you want to call it misperceptions on that. That's really a good point. Second question, so informed the eventual type of respondents to the future project. So to clarify, in the sense that we do not assume that the eventual type of respondents they know there will be projects in the future, and we do not need this assumption, because what we need is that those projects, in terms of their demographic characteristics, they are similar to the respondents already exposed to active projects. And actually, we do not want them to the awareness. So it's just like it's two parts of two groups. Maybe they have the similar education level, both living in urban area, similar age, or any other type of unobserved factors you can think about. That's actually one particular challenge. For example, if Chinese FDI strategically target in places where perception towards China is high, then it will be problematic. So and this type of comparing acting with eventual can result to this type of things, because those places are going to have Chinese FDI soon. So we can think about the baseline perceptions probably is very similar.
Could you find places where attitudes about China are already extremely negative, so China doesn't invest there? I mean, I'm trying to think of, are there such places? in Africa. There's certainly places where US investors won't go. Like US investors will not go to Venezuela because
Yeah.
they know at least the government is going to be anti-American, right? So they're not going to, bring in a lot of new investment now.
Yeah.
So that would, poison and the reverse could be true. Yeah.
Right. So I think in some of the analysis, I think maybe one study, they found that the Chinese foreign aid, specifically targeted on places where perceptions towards China is low. So the foreign aid goes in and try to change the patterns. As for FDI, we think that because FDI are more market driven and profit driven, and also like there are some studies which might not be true, but there are some studies saying that Chinese firms are more risk acceptance, like compared with the US firms. So, but the purpose of comparing active and virtual, it just rule out all these type of things to make it comparable. Thanks.
Thanks so much. Very interesting. I was wondering, maybe this question is a little bit out of the scope of this project, but why you think there's so many negative results in terms of affinity for the FDI projects? The findings on influence seem to make sense, but it is a little bit surprising. I mean, I guess, first of all, do you think this is applicable to FDI in general, just because, all of the projects fall short of all these huge expectations? Or do you think that there's more heterogeneity depending on different characteristics of the FDI projects, which you may not have the data for, but especially given the sort of positive and negative mechanisms you discussed early in the presentation around jobs or the types of FDI, do you think that could be driving part of it? Or is it just that FDI in general is going to have this negative impact?
Thanks, Stephanie, for the question and excellent question. So, and you can see, so this project shows you the result, like of how it affects influence and how it affects affinity, whether it's positive or negative. But this project does not answer the questions of why, which is like the limitations and we want to know, like, well, we know theoretically there are different mechanisms, so we already know the mechanisms are there. But the question is really how to empirically distinguish like which one works. So, and this is what we haven't been able to do. So we are also quite striking by this result, because really maybe you think that in terms of affinity, Chinese FDI and US FDI they generate like different results. It's not. It's the same. So it's probably not something related with China. So it's not some unique Chinese practice that's driven this. Yes, we compare, which is better than just the Chinese FDI alone. But China is also unique since that they are both great powers. So one time it's from UK, from Germany, so there are different mechanisms that can lead to this. And exactly why we haven't been able to answer this. So it's very empirically. So that's probably the next steps I want to do. Thanks.
This question comes from Hong Zhang, who's another one of our recent fellows of the program. She says, fantastic presentation. She was curious if FDI is the best way for one to look at evidence of visibility-based mechanisms for influence and affinity. She says that Chinese FDI in Africa is actually much lower than project contracting activities of Chinese construction firms, especially in the infrastructure sector. These infrastructure projects tend to be more high profile, thus higher national awareness and visibility, but they're mostly not FDI. Some are financed by Chinese loans, others are financed by multinational development agencies or bilateral donors or local governments. Also, thinking of general descriptions of the sectors and sizes of China and US FDI projects could help. I assume Chinese FDI tends to be in manufacturing, mining projects, and other construction-related fields, which may be quite small scale and localized, thus limited visibility. US FDI may tend to be in the service sector or in upstream sectors such as oil and gas, and they could also be generally more visible. Thoughts?
Yeah, thanks. I think it's a good question. And comments. So like really Chinese FDI is the best way to document visibility. I think I agree, and actually as you can see that the in terms of influence, especially in terms of influence, the results from US FDI is more clear, and the results from Chinese FDI is more or less like ambiguous. And while we interpret the finding as a collocation, but it could also be, as Jonathan said, the different degree of visibility. So it could also be, but I want to note that in terms of the absolute influence, like if you ask whether people think about China's economic influence is a lot, we did find more or less prominent effects, suggesting that maybe people are aware of what's going on around them. And again, I think this is an assumption we should address because African people, the local citizens, they may not know, or they don't know the culture of origins. It's not that easy for them to know, at least not in every case. So, especially as China is a newcomer, maybe for US firms, we may be able to identify this value, but for children, it's difficult. I think she's right. And also sectors also a good point. So actually, we're able to distinguish different sectors, and I think you're right in terms of US investment primarily in the service sector, and Chinese manufacturing, and also some service sectors. But even among the same sectors, even within the same sector, even within the service sector, we find that the type of investment is quite different. So a lot of US service sector concentrate on consulting, finance, business service, this type of firms, and service sector, which is quite interesting, is in stocks. So this is a different like mechanisms, and we should further explore that. So,
but a Chinese development loan for a road that is expected to be paid back at market rates, it would not be coded as FDI.
So
That's what Hong Kong
yeah. So let me clarify like on this, which is very important question, and I didn't mention on the data source. So the data source FDI market. So we didn't collect the data. So the project level data is collected by Financial Times, and based on their criteria, so they only include greenfield investment,
Okay.
which means the
Infrastructure.
yes, even it's merging. It's not in their data set. It has to be a physical process in the continent and they come back. So but I think the Chinese are absolutely right in terms of this data set captures different types of investment, different values or other things. So and we should see more carefully about what it means in terms of visibility and other things. Yeah. Thanks.
Other questions? No? Well, we're a little after 6, so I think maybe we should close out the session. We'll ask more questions during lunch.
You're not going to eat, so you can cook them all.
Yeah.
Oh,
So the speaker gets.
Thank you for joining us on this. This is our last event of the semester. I'm still scheduled, so we will see you all in the new year. And happy holidays and have a good one. Have a good night.
You have any idea
Of what? What I do?
why the university seminar was canceled on Thursday?
The what seminar?
The modern China seminar.
Oh, I don't know.
Oh, we don't know. Yeah, we don't handle that.